Hi, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Nicholas Slaughter, and I'm a principal consultant here at Mandiant. I've helped to develop the current security program assessment model for our organization. I'll be assisting on today's call as Tim Appleby is currently unavailable. But I appreciate you all joining. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the top 10 components that help to create a proactive cybersecurity organization based on Mandiant's findings. As a result of our assessments with many different organizations across varying size and in many different industries. The goal of today's presentation is to break down the very large undertaking of moving an organization from a reactive, after the fact posture to one that is more capable of handling potential incidents in a more proactive way by dismantling the project into smaller, more digestible components. To address some of the logistics for today, we'll give you a little bit of background on Mandiant before we get started. Um, So, a little bit of background here. We are well known as expert responders for critical security incidents around the world. However, we also offer a full range of cybersecurity services beyond breach response, such as program builds, security transformation projects, incident response services and retainers, critical information or infrastructure protection, and a multitude of intelligence capabilities. Mandiant has a worldwide presence as part of the FIRE organization with over 1,500 employees in over 40 countries to support our global services around the world. So, a little bit about the logistics of the presentation itself. You may notice in the top left-hand corner a button that will allow you to ask questions. I hope to get as many question and answers done as possible at the end of the presentation, and this will be where you can actually present them for the Q&A portion of the presentation. Additionally, you'll notice attachments button that will let you get a copy of today's slides. Additionally, an email after the presentation is over with will be sent out with the presentation containing the link to this recording as well. Additionally, for those of you attending today's presentation, Mandiant is going to submit one CPE credit to ISC Squared today on your behalf with the information you provided during your registration for the presentation. However, this only applies to the live attendees on the call in case you're listening to this recorded version of this call afterwards. If after the presentation you have any unanswered questions, please feel free to send them to info@fireeye.com. And with all the logistics out of the way, let's dive into the presentation. So to go over today's agenda for today's meeting, we're going to be talking about the components that make a successful, proactive security organization. This will include the organization's overall framework, as you can see here, a description of the 10 components that Mandiant has identified as critical to develop a proactive security posture, and the best practices contained with each. For each of these components, we're going to take a little bit of time to discuss those top 5 best practices, and the different elements you see here represent the verticals that should be present in every mature information security organization. However, we're going to, like I said, dive in a bit deeper, but it should be aware that when we start talking about the individual components or the individual elements and best practices of each component, that we're not providing a comprehensive list. Rather, we're providing the critical top 5 for moving your organization from a reactive stance to a proactive stance. As you can see here, we have a lot to cover in the next hour. And like I said before, I want to leave as much time for questions and answers at the end of our presentation as possible. So we'll move right on to the next slide. As I said before, it's important to note that the best practices here are fundamental items of each component. These will vary slightly from niche organizations and different industry verticals, and you may see modifications every so often, but for the most part, this is what Mandiant recommends as the best practices across the 10 components that we have listed here. These really are the top 5 critical items that you must have in place to be considered proactive. So let's talk a bit about the layered approach. When we talk about the overall framework of a successful proactive security organization, what do we actually mean? Well, a proactive organization is one that is driven by clear goals and a mission statement, that is developed by strategic entities at the top, at the strategic layer, and that helps to define the organization's information security strategy. This includes the security vision, the overall structure of the security organization, as well as providing the authority to drive the organization to be as secure as possible while also taking into account the requirements of the business as a whole. The strategic layer truly is the vision of the organization and truly is the one that helps define the strategy to move forward. Um, Not to mention that very critical component there that it's the ones that provides the authority so that changes can actually be made. So the strategic organization should feed into the tactical layer, which you can see in green here, and this represents the oversight and management that helps to promote and push the strategic vision. This layer is typically comprised of any audit and compliance groups, incident management teams, risk management teams, as well as those teams that help define policy and privacy standards. Training and awareness typically falls into the tactical layer as well, as this group holds the requirement of developing training programs for the front lines in conjunction with the strategic layer of the organization. The foundation of this entire framework is built on the boots on the ground, or the operational layer. This is where a transition occurs between the overall security and governance organization, which are typically comprised of the strategic and tactical layers, and the operational roles being split into individual departments. So you can see the technical and security access controls, monitoring and reporting, physical and environmental, all of the individual departments that typically make up silos at an organization. You'll notice that many of the components defined throughout the rest of this presentation will focus primarily on the operation layer, as it's considered the front line of threat prevention and risk mitigation. However, this is kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that most of the companies that Mandiant provides assessments for find themselves trying to perform all layers, including strategic and tactical, of the cybersecurity framework within the operational tier. Because of this, organizations can get focused on primarily putting out the campfires directly in front of them and are unable to see the larger forest fire just over the next ridge. But a proactive organization leads from a top-down approach, letting the security vision and strategy cascade down into the other components of the framework. So the need for cybersecurity program is widely recognized. It's important to understand that a security program is more than any one thing. Rather, it is comprised of 10 different areas. These components are based on a combination of industry standards, such as those from the American Institute of CPAs, the European Network and Information Security Agency Information Assurance Framework, control objectives for information and related technologies, COVID, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards, PCI DSS, and NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And Mandiant's own experience gained from over a decade of responding to security incidents across a wide variety of industries worldwide. In keeping with the theme of a top-down approach, we're going to start with the first component, which is governance, compliance, and organization. It is here where strategy is defined that leads the rest of the organization to meet the goals that merge business and security together. This is where policy is defined, standards and guidelines are developed, and compliance considerations such as PCI for retail or HIPAA for healthcare should be identified. This component is typically designed by the goals of the strategic layer, with the tactical layer driving the organization and providing the oversight necessary to ensure the organization is actually on target. The policies, procedures, and guidelines developed within this component should filter down and influence all other components of a proactive organization. And you'll see this as we go through more of the components. You'll see it tie back a lot to the best practices of governance, compliance, and organization, which is ideally how it should be. The rest of the components should actually be fed from this element here. So moving on to the best practices. So for each of the best practices, what I figured I would do here is rather than just reading them off the screen, is I'll read them, go over them, and then we'll talk a little bit about them and get more detail. So the first best practice here is a dedicated IT security organization should exist to drive policy, standards, mission, and governance from a top-down perspective. You've heard me repeat that over and over, and that's why it's one of our most critical top components that you'll see here. This highlights the need that the organization is driven from a top-down approach in order to be proactive and to be prepared for potential risk and incidents before they occur, rather than maintaining a posture of reacting to situations when they occur, which is often the case in organizations led by silos of the operation layer. So at less mature organizations where security is handled on a case-by-case basis, and you have the people who are in charge of perimeter protection, endpoint protection, compliance, and they're all working on their own individual security management, you'll see a disconnect oftentimes between those different silos because there's no overhead function that actually feeds down and tailors to them. And that really is representative of a reactive organization rather than being proactive in your security posture. So number 2 here, information security should have board level oversight and support. This is a very critical component as well. Proactive security requires board support and buy-in in order to provide the security organization with the means to mature their posture. This is also the component that provides the security organization as a whole with the authority needed to support a proactive model. You'll see a couple times here that we'll talk about having the authority to make the changes or making sure that risk management, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, or risk acceptance are accepted by an authority. And the reason being is that whenever you begin to merge business with security, you get that conflict and that friction there, and you do need board level support and oversight in order to push through and make sure that the business and security are actually merging together versus security just being stopped dead in the tracks because it makes the business a little bit more difficult. It really does have to be a marriage between the two. So number 3, formal security strategy should be developed, including a mission statement, policies, and standards. In developing this strategy, industry best practices, such as those found in NIST and other regulatory guidelines, should be considered. These policies and standards should also consider the industry the organization is in and any compliance requirements that may be necessary. Obviously, like PCI, HIPAA, we've covered a couple, FISMA if you're federal. It is here that the policies and standards guide the rest of the components that are developed. Number 4, oversight to enforce compliance with policies and standards should be established. As we discussed before, a successful security organization is one that possesses that board-supported authority. We're all aware of the potential conflict that can arise here, so it's important for the security organization to have the authority to address the business concerns. So when we talked about that friction there, the security should have a proactive security stance will be that you do have the authority to address those business considerations in terms of merging them with the security considerations. Number 5, policies and standards should be consistent with all key controls. This is another key item. There have been times in the past where we've gone to an organization to provide a maturity assessment, only to find out that the policies appear to be written by many different functions within the organization, and that oftentimes they conflict with other policies, thus creating confusion as to which standards an organization should be expected to follow. At the very least, the policies and standards should require a sign-off by a responsible party to ensure continuity across the board. We'll actually go in and find that people have brought policies from their previous organizations and just tried to copy and paste the new name of the organization in, and it doesn't fit in at all with the new organization's strategy or vision, and so it will directly contradict other policies in terms of what is to be expected. So moving to data protection. Data protection component is exactly what it sounds like. The measure that an organization has in place to protect the data that it utilizes to do business. This can include special considerations such as PCI or personally identifiable information, so PII as well. And moving to a proactive posture, this component covers data classification, paying special attention to high-value targets such as critical assets or sensitive information such as financial or customer information. Additionally, the organization should focus on data handling requirements and key controls for securing data in a proactive manner. So to go over the best practices here, formal enterprise-wide data classification policy should be documented. You will actually see this repeated in many other controls throughout this, or references back to the data classification policy. But to expand a little bit, this is the foundational component that should be in place within any organization that possesses sensitive data, which is every organization. Every organization has some form of sensitive data that could be compromising, or financial information that could get out, or proprietary information that doesn't need to be leaked to the overall market that could be considered sensitive data. The policy is a prerequisite and should guide the development of all subsequent policies, such as the data handling policy, and should help define some key controls that protect this data. That data classification policy really is the foundation with which all data protection should be built on. Number 2, employees should have a mechanism to assign data classification labels to data. This is essentially the mechanism that allows users to adhere to the data classification policy and to define the level of security that should be associated with the data. In addition, one thing I would add here is that not only should employees have the mechanism to assign data classification labels, but they should also be aware of what the different data classification levels are. It's not enough just to develop the policy. You really do have to present it out and communicate it and disseminate it amongst the end user base so they actually know where to position data within your network. Number three, all stakeholders should understand what data should be protected and how. This is a continuance of the trend of providing two-way methods of communication between those that handle assets and information and those that are in charge of oversight. This element also blends in pretty nicely to data discovery processes and initiatives. Uh, Basically, the thought here is that if you're unfamiliar with what data your organization currently handles and maintains, how can you be proactive in protecting it? So having that visibility is definitely critical to being the proactive security posture. Number four, device encryption should be deployed across all end user systems. This extends to mobile devices as well. I can't tell you how often I've gone to a client site where they told me during an assessment that their endpoints had all top of the line encryption. And then we asked them, well, what information do phones have access to, employee cell phones? Oh, well, they can get their email, they can get their download files from the internet and everything that you could do here. Well, are those encrypted? Is there a policy that requires encryption there? No. And so then it starts the whole question over again. If you're going to provide outlets to deter from your security posture, you need to make sure that you're encrypting them as well. So entitlement should be based on data classification. As I mentioned before, the data classification policy should influence nearly all aspects of data protection. Role-based access controls are fundamental to have, but without clearly defining what data people are being given access to based on their role, as well as tracking it, there's going to be a hole in the entire process. So moving right along here, and I realize we only have about an hour to do this, so I'm trying to cover the domains as quickly as possible, or the components as quickly as possible. However, in the event you do have any questions or you have any insights in regards to what we're talking about here today, please feel free to post them up in the questions from the audience. So best practices with security risk management. Security risk management is the third link of the chain and focuses on managing risk to the environment. Organizations are never truly going to be invulnerable to risk. Even the most sophisticated organizations I've been to, those with the most expansive budgets and fully staffed headcounts, which is rare, and those they're still vulnerable to risk. You can't do business without accepting some level of risk. But a proactive environment is one that actively seeks out to find out where they're vulnerable and plans accordingly rather than waiting to find out the hard way. As you can read here in the slide, risk management is about identifying, assessing, addressing, and addressing security risks to your organization before they become incidents. So it's that active measure of going out and looking for where you're vulnerable versus just preparing for a risk to happen or an incident to occur. When we look at the best practices here, number one, a formal IT risk management function should exist. Oftentimes, this is present within the operational level of organizations, where each individual functional silo is working to manage their own endpoints or platforms, like we talked about before. But there's very little oversight and even less centralized management typically found in these scenarios. Everybody's kind of an island unto themselves. A formal management function should exist that collects information on all vulnerabilities in a centralized core location and tracks remediation efforts, as well as providing visibility on the security posture of the organization to the strategic layer, as well as the tactical layer. You really do need to have a centralized core that can accept all the different vulnerabilities and can parse out and disseminate the information to the appropriate stakeholders. Number two, security representatives should participate in the enterprise risk management function. This ties organically into the first recommendation. It basically ensures that the security organization is able to better posture their efforts to account for risk at the organization. The security organization can only protect the business from threats it knows about. The more it is aware of, the more it can plan for. Number three, all risks should be evaluated based on a common risk framework. This is pretty fundamental, but a lot of organizations miss the mark here. Much like requiring an organization to classify all data using a defined data classification policy to ensure that everybody's working on the same page, risks should be handled the same way. There may even be regulatory requirements that require adherence to a specific framework, and if only half the organization is actually evaluating risk based on that, then the other half is negligent, maybe presenting a problem. So number four, There should be a formal risk acceptance process for sign-off by executive owners based on the appropriate signatory authority. Simply put, risk acceptance should have accountability tied to it. No, not only should the risk acceptance have accountability, but it should be tied to an executive level owner that has the authority to actually accept risk to the business. So this can't simply be a manager that goes, yeah, I'll accept a risk. This needs to be somebody that the visibility needs to be all the way up to somebody that actually can accept risk on behalf of the business itself. Simply allowing a risk process to exist without this responsibility in place is essentially allowing holes to be punched in the security of the organization with nobody really accountable in the event something goes wrong. But when accountability comes into play, organizations tend to be more conservative with the risk they accept. All IT functions within the organization should be held to this standard. So this isn't just information security. This should be pretty much the entire IT infrastructure or the entire IT organization should have to follow the same risk exception policy. Number 5, risk management should be integrated into all facets of service management, including incident, problem, change, and ticket management. This ties in closely to the second best practice on our list here. There should not be an element of the organization's IT structure, especially in the security organization, that's exempt from the risk management process. So incident management, problem, change, they all need to be held to the same risk management process. So moving on to the next slide. So access management, we all know a little bit about access management, and so we'll dive in a bit more to discuss what makes it actually proactive. So access management is pretty straightforward and should exist in every organization to some degree. This is one of the places where we've typically seen organizations make the most effort to move to a proactive stance because of the long-held understanding that if they can't get past our walls in the first place, they can't cause a whole lot of damage. However, with the growing sophistication of attacks and the ever-evolving threat landscape, this is quickly becoming an insufficient mindset. Simply put, access management is about reducing access to sensitive data, and many of the elements here overlap with the data protection component that we discussed a little bit earlier. So looking at the best practices, entitlement should be provisioned based on the principles of need to know and least privilege. So this is a common element that we talk about with a lot of organizations, but it's one that we find is often stated being done, but is more often than not only being done to a certain degree or only being done in certain areas, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But to talk more about this best practice, organizations that lead from the operational layer typically have a greater issue with this than more mature organizations because it's more common to have one-off provisions or admins with access to an entire data set of the organization. And it's kind of a byproduct of that mindset of having people that must wear multiple hats. So smaller organizations, we see this. Less mature organizations or newer security organizations, we see this a lot. However, it's an approach that increases risk to posture to the entire organization because it can cause an oversight and potentially massive holes in the security framework that's built to protect the business. The proactive security organization is one that focuses on limiting access to information based on whether or not the data is critical to the job role, and the measures to adhere to at least privileged access, such as periodic entitlement reviews. So making sure that you're not just doing role-based access control, but you're defining what data those roles actually need to have access to. And that all ties back to the data classification policy from earlier. And then how do you manage that entitlement? So the next best practice is changes in user roles or responsibilities should be reconciled per transfer process, and associated oversight should exist. On the surface, this appears to only cover users that transfer from one role to another, ensuring that their access to data is limited only to their new role. And that's what we see most organizations that are in a reactive state focusing on. However, we're also talking about changes in roles, like elements of terminations, leave of absence holds. So if somebody is going on vacation and is going to be gone for 4 weeks, they should suspend that access. And other elements that extend beyond is simply what does this user do today and what should they have access to. So number 3, privileged account access and activity should be limited in scope, duration, and identifiable by resource and role and monitored for misuse. To put this in more straightforward terms, a proactive security organization knows who has privileged access, enforces limited access to only exactly what is needed, ensures that the access has a time limit, and is given extra considerations when it comes to monitoring. Essentially the same forms of consideration and monitoring that you would give to the person you just handed your company's vault keys to. You want to make sure that privileged accounts are receiving that extra consideration. Number 4, multi-factor authentication should exist to access the sensitive, business-critical, and secure systems. This element that is prevalent in many organizations, but oftentimes limited in scope. It's not really unusual to go to a client site and find out that they have multi-factor authentication, but it only works on certain network segments, or only certain users have to utilize it to access to the network, or it's a project that's been in development and implementation for 2 years and they've never got around to finishing it. There's a lot of different elements here that can come into play as to multi-factor authentication and why it hasn't been pushed out across the board, but a truly proactive environment makes sure that anyone who has access to your company's most valuable assets should be required to have the two separate keys in order to get access to it. And then number 5, finally, separation of duties should be enforced between provisioning and oversight. Simply put, the same people that are providing provisioning should not be the ones evaluating whether or not the process is being sufficiently adhered to. You'll see kind of a recurring theme in terms of separation or segregation of duties throughout these components, just because in order to provide especially in the vulnerability management portion, especially to provide an objective view of the organization, you have to be able to provide that objective level of oversight that can make a clear binary determination: is this being followed, yes or no? So moving on to incident response. Incident response is one of the most critical areas that helps to define an organization's security posture, be it reactive or proactive. Now, by name alone, incident response seems to be a wholly reactive component as you are responding to incidents, which is reactive in nature. However, by incorporating elements like threat intelligence, advanced threat detection, hunting techniques, and specialized training, an organization's incident response function can evolve from simply responding to events to being the defensive frontline and intelligence core of the entire security organization. So we'll look at some best practices for incident response. There the slide goes. So number 1, incident response plans and playbooks should be developed and integrated throughout the entire enterprise and its IR stakeholders. So the incident response plan should be the comprehensive guide, the one-stop shop to responding to incidents within the entire organization. It should be the single point of reference for all things related to responding to an incident, and it should clearly define roles, processes, stakeholders, and everything pertinent to responding to an incident. This should be developed by the information security organization or the incident response team if your company has one, or develops one in the future, and it should be communicated out to all operational silos, so all the functions in that operational layer, so that they have an understanding of what their roles and responsibilities are in the event of an actual incident. Now, the difference between an incident response playbook or an incident response plan and a playbook is playbooks should be developed to address specific threats, such as a ransomware attack or unauthorized privilege escalation. They should be developed for a single scenario and how you should handle a single scenario versus the overall comprehensive guide. Number 2, an escalation matrix should exist, identifying the key stakeholders pertaining to incident handling. The escalation matrix is what ties incident response to the rest of the organization. This is what defines the who, when, and how of reaching the relevant operational functions in the event of an incident. Without this, the time to respond to an incident begins to grow exponentially if your responders are struggling to contact the appropriate resources that can assist with the remediation or investigation. It's not uncommon for an alert to happen at 2 in the morning. That is a critical incident alert, such as lateral movement across the network or privilege escalations of an admin, something you want to respond to very quickly, but the people that you need to actually talk to are home asleep and they don't necessarily know that they're on shift to be available to be reached out to. So having that escalation matrix clearly defines who and what and when needs to be reached in the event of an incident. Now, the difference between a escalation matrix and a communication plan, a thorough communication plan should exist to guide internal and external communication flows in the event of a breach or security incident. So a communications plan, as compared to an escalation plan, is designed to direct communication efforts during or after an incident or breach. This plan defines what information should be provided to relevant parties, when it should be provided, and the means by which the information should be shared. This should include communication to the strategic layer participants, as well as any other appropriate stakeholders. Bear in mind the data handling and classification policies when deciding the relevant parties that should be included in this document. So, for example, if you discover a potential breach has occurred at your organization, you want to keep that least uh, least amount of people involved in it as possible, the only ones that are need to know. Your communication plan should list out exactly who is on that need to know basis so that you're keeping information close to your chest. This is especially considered in the event that you have a potential breach that could impact external parties, so for example, customers or anybody that you maintain data for. Number four, log aggregation, normalization, and correlation should exist for all systems identified necessary for visibility throughout the infrastructure. So, simply put, one of the most common recurring themes in shifting an organization from reactive to proactive stance is getting that visibility into the network and the activities occurring within it. Log aggregation and correlation should be routed to a centralized core that allows for visibility across the entire environment rather than having individual operational silos monitoring their own infrastructure. A lot of times this is where a SIM comes into play, but you have to have the appropriate resources that can actually monitor that, which leads us to our next best practice. And this is one of the larger best practices of this entire, of all 10 components. A security operations center should be established to ensure proper incident handling and consistency. So when organizations start to investigate potential incorporation of a security operations center or a SOC into their environment, many see the cost of maintaining an on-site 24 by 7, 365 operation with the appropriate staffing, and they get pretty overwhelmed by the project pretty quick. The cost can go very high, especially depending on any kind of requirements that you have for monitoring multiple networks, monitoring multiple segments, monitoring any kind of niche or specializations that they have to monitor. The complexity of the entire SOC goes up. But though a security operations center is a foundational cornerstone of a proactive incident response organization, it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-blown on-site endeavor. I've personally built out security operations centers for many clients over the years, some that worked with basic software functionality and relied on email notifications for off-hours monitoring. I actually just dealt with a client that has a small core group of people working during the day, and at night they're all required to have their work cell phones with them for email notifications in the event that the SIM discovers any kind of malfeasance. I've worked with the people that have used an MSSP to come in and provide a full functionality for the entire SOC, or at least partial functionality in terms of off-hour support or weekend support. And even those with major budget SOCs that have a fully staffed on-site center that incorporated things like forensic capabilities and had proactive hunting teams built into their framework. So a SOC doesn't necessarily have to be the large and expensive effort that many organizations assume it is, but it is necessary for an organization to be proactive in their incident response posture and activities. So moving on to the next section here, the third-party vendor management. This is one of the components that we most often see organizations struggling with, mostly because only recently have organizations started to pay more close attention to this. There have been several large instances where a third-party vendor was either the pivot point or the entry point of a malfeasance into the owner's network. So it's not uncommon these days to hear about an organization being breached through a third-party vendor that had trusted access to a business environment, but they may not have had the same security standards as the organizations that they work for. This is truly one of the more complicated threats as an organization faces in trying to be proactive about it, because it requires scrutiny to be cast upon the security practices of a completely different organization. And all the companies I've been to, it's been extremely rare to find one that doesn't outsource at least some components of their operations to a third-party provider. This could be anything from a full-fledged MSSP that handle many different elements of the business to hosting providers that help offset data center costs. Each one provides a direct link back to your organization that can act as a tunnel under even the best-built walls of your security organization if they become compromised. However, a proactive approach to this is actually quite simple, and compared to some of the other key controls, can be implemented with a fairly lower investment than some of the other key controls. Moving on to the best practices here. Number one, the IT security function should be involved in the evaluation of all third-party solutions. This ties all the way back to the requirements that I mentioned in security risk management, but essentially it ensures that the security organization has oversight into the review of components such as what access does the third party need, what data do they need access to, how long will they need the access, providing temporary requirements for how long that access will be provided for. This sets the stage for many elements of this component, but provides an additional proactive level of review that many organizations lack. Number two, all third-party all third-party relationships should be bound by the policies and standards governing the organization, along with the associated key controls defined within. More simply stated, your vendors should be required to adhere to the same scrutiny and security controls and requirements that your internal staff is held to. The complicated part of this best practice comes once an organization begins to make the proactive shift and they realize that either minimal or no requirements have ever been required of their vendors. Now they must review or request evidence that the vendors are actually meeting their organization's requirements. That can be a time-consuming or fairly large project to undertake in the event that a lot has been outsourced over the years and not much in the way of requirements have ever been requested. Number three, oversight of compliance with the enterprise policies and standards should be enforced. This ties in pretty directly with the previous best practices, and that there should be oversight to ensure that vendors are actually adhering to the policies set in place. This oversight should have a direct line of communication to provide executive level visibility of any non-compliance. In the event that you do have a vendor that is not complying with the requirements that you have set, in the event that you have a vendor that is not compliant in terms of what their current security standards are, and they don't provide mitigating controls, this needs to be elaborated to the strategic layer so the decisions can be made about, do we still continue using this vendor? Do we push for recommendations or requirements? So number four, all exceptions to enterprise standards and policies for third-party providers should be accountable at the appropriate level of signatory authority. So this is the same proactive requirement that was discussed in the security risk management component. If an exception to a process or policy of the organization occurs, it should be signed off by an accountable individual with the authority to actually accept risk on behalf of the business organization. So talking about the oversight being transparent all the way up to the strategic and tactical layers, if that oversight is going to occur and be allowed, it has to be accepted by somebody who can actually accept risk on behalf of the business. So number five, all negotiations and associated contractual agreements should include representation by IT security or IT security risk management. Very closely related to the first best practices in this component, this basically ensures that the security or risk organizations of the business have some oversight in the contractual agreements to ensure that they're not setting themselves up for potential failure, or they're not agreeing to something that is completely against process and policies and security procedures, or something that might present risk or compromise the security posture of the business. So moving on here. So best practices, host and endpoint protection. We talked about certain elements of host and endpoint protection, such as advanced threat detection and encryption standards earlier in the presentation. But this is going to be the section where we truly hone in on what drives this component to a proactive state. To be proactive, the host and endpoint infrastructure at a business must take a defense in depth approach that allows for maximum visibility into the endpoint security posture, that prevents a wide range of threats to endpoints in real time, and uses advanced threat protection capabilities to combat emerging threats as they continue to evolve and emerge from the wild. Going through the recommended best practices here, the required best practices, I should say. Number one, baseline host configurations should be developed and monitored for changes. So organizations are traditionally aware of and used to the process of having a standard or what they consider a gold image at their environments. However, organizations in the past typically have left this up to the endpoint deployment teams or possibly some of the IT functional silos, and to develop with minimal involvement from the security organization. However, in an effort to mature the organization's security posture to a more proactive approach, security should be involved in development, at least providing oversight of the standard host configurations to ensure they're meeting all the requirements that are laid out by the security risk management organization. These configurations should be monitored for deviations from the standard configurations, either by internal or potentially malicious threat actors. Number two, endpoint logging requirements and retention should be implemented and reviewed. As an organization matures to a proactive stance, they must also increase their visibility into all facets of their landscape, including endpoints. Endpoints should be logged and fed into a centralized repository like a SIM we talked about earlier, as well as the protection mechanisms in place on them, such as any kind of anti-malware solutions or DLP solutions. These logs should be tailored as not overload the organization with false positives, but to provide actionable intelligence to incident responders in order to remediate threats as they're detected. So when we talk about trimming it down and tailoring it to where you're not receiving a lot of false positives, a lot of organizations, whenever they get a SIM, they try to start immediately sending everything that comes off of an endpoint to the SIM for review, but they quickly find out that they're running out of space or that's going to cost more, and really it's just because they're sending everything, including sign on, sign off, and the basic system information in the background, and they're not really tailoring all the logging to be actionable. They want to look for actionable intelligence out of it. So number 3, endpoint protection should be updated regularly and monitored for deviations based on a standard. As an extension of the security risk management component, this best practices focuses on ensuring that endpoint protection capabilities are often updated and with the latest vendor updates. Any endpoints that fall outside of this process or that have not been updated have the ability of presenting risk to the environment, so they should be monitored and reported on to the governance and compliance organization until they're brought up to standard. Moving on to number 4, vulnerability management programs should be implemented across all endpoints. So we can have an entire webinar, an entire discussion on dedicated to just what functions the vulnerability management team should have. A proactive program is one that actually merges accountability and oversight with the organization's risk strategy. That's the fundamental component that makes it proactive. The program should be transparent and maintain segregation of duties in order to provide an objective view into the organization's security posture as it pertains to the potential vulnerabilities their infrastructure may face. So a reactive or a potentially less mature organization that still operates out of the operational layer or relies on the individual silos to present and manage their own vulnerabilities may not necessarily know what critical vulnerabilities are missing unless they have that objective view from the top down to actually monitor and ensure compliance and ensure that they are updated. So number 5, local administration rights should be eliminated or limited based on a risk exception process. So this is a particularly controversial topic for a lot of our organizations. Most of the times when we go to places that are being led by the operational layer, it is a sticking point with them that it's not something that they want to do. They don't want to give up the local administration rights. It's another symptom of organizations where admins wear multiple hats and perform many different job roles. The focus of this best practice is most commonly recommended for end users that don't need local admin rights to begin with, but it also extends to the entire organization with the understanding that any critical job functions where local admin rights are required to have that ability to apply for a risk exception that would allow the access to continue, albeit maybe on a monitored or a reviewed basis. So in the event that it is truly critical to business and it is truly critical for organizations to maintain that local admin, it follows the risk exception process as anything should, and the appropriate risk is signed off on at the appropriate level. So moving on, best practices for application, database, and mobile protection. The next component seems to cover quite a large swath of infrastructure, and it does, but in many ways we're using a lot of the same techniques and tactics for applications, databases, and mobile protection that we would have used in previous components. However, here there's a heavy focus set on the system development lifecycle as well, and the inclusion of security into it for all elements contained within the component. So going through the best practices. Least privilege, segregation of duty, and defense in depth should be ensured. You've heard me talk about least privilege and segregations of duties many times throughout this presentation, especially during data protection, but it's equally as important here. Ensuring that people only have access to what they need to perform their job and separating duties, like providing that access and oversight over the process of granting it, are two ways that a proactive organization can stay ahead of the curve in this component. Additionally, although a defense in-depth approach should be addressed throughout the entire organization, it's essentially important when protecting the applications and databases of the business, so that belt and suspenders approach. Number 2, security should be integrated into the SDLC. A common theme you may have noticed in an effort to mature from a reactive organization to a proactive one is the inclusion of security into functions that it may not have previously been integrated with. One such area is the SDLC of an organization. Any new system that is introduced into the collective whole should involve security oversight at all stages of the process from planning to implementation. This allows security organization to better understand new implementations or changes to the environment and how they may affect the overall security posture of the organization. By having security involvement throughout the process, it allows security to raise concerns or catch any potential risks that may arise from before the implementation. You always want to catch as much as you can before implementation, then find out afterwards or get hit by any kind of hidden gotchas later down the road. Number three, businesses should define a recovery strategy for assets supporting their applications. So knowing how to recover from mission critical applications such as a core banking application at a bank or the back-end databases containing customer information for a retail or healthcare organization is critical and should be planned for, tested often, and those tests should be reviewed. Organizations should be very clearly able to identify how long recovery should take, who is expected to be part of the process, and how recovery will occur. Moving on to number four, data backups of sensitive information should be ensured and safeguarded. We're focusing here on the crown jewels of the organization, the sensitive or mission critical data that the organization relies on to be able to perform business. While data backups on endpoints and servers are obviously important, a proactive organization is one that takes additional steps to ensure that the data backups of their most important assets are not only given considerations like redundant backups, but are also stored in secured and encrypted repositories that keep the information contained safe. Storing backups in this way increases business investments in both cost and time, so making the decision to be proactive in this manner is a step that many organizations have trouble moving towards. It slows the entire process down whenever you start to try and encrypt something. It obviously increases the cost of data backups whenever you're looking for redundancy. But this is truly what a proactive organization is focused on, is making sure and doubling down on the protection and backups of sensitive information. So number five, developers should not have access to production data under any circumstances. Much like removing local admin rights on an endpoint, this is another topic of discussion that's a bit controversial and can raise some heated conversations when we're on site. However, there must be a clear line that separates developer environments from the overall production environment. This is an issue that arises in companies of every size and at every level of maturity. I've seen the most mature organization that I've ever actually been to and done an assessment for, that was one of the few things that they were still presenting as a risk. And this is somebody with a massive security budget. The developers are still having access to production environments, and that can't really happen in a proactive situation. So moving on here, and I'm trying to be cognizant of time. So best practices for network and perimeter protection. As we're nearing the presentation here, and nearing the end of the presentation here, I want to discuss the best practices for the network and perimeter protection component. Many of the items that are considered best practices here may already be in place at your organization. The elements within this component are designed to centralize the protection capabilities, use advanced threat detection and remediation techniques to combat APTs, segment the network in a way that helps to limit access and potential malicious activity, and utilize a layered approach to protecting the network and perimeter. So going into the best practices here, when we talk about number one, protection and detection capabilities should be put in place to block or detect APTs. As we begin to talk about network and perimeter best practices, one of the foundational elements of a proactive organization is going to be the ability to detect and defend against advanced adversaries and their techniques. Most next-gen products are going to boast the capability of this to some degree, and I'm sure most organizations have next-gen capabilities in terms of their firewalls or IDSs, but it's vital that the perimeter defenses that an organization utilizes actually has this functionality. So test it. Hold its task and actually see what capabilities it has to stop APTs. Read up on the documentation that the vendors put out in terms of what they're protecting against, and actually investigate that to make sure that it actually has it. So number two, perimeter protection should be governed by policy and effectively extend to corporate borders to all third-party and external network segments. This all ties back to the compliance and governance component, but policy should dictate how perimeter protection should be designed and implemented. This provides a consistent framework across the entire environment and is going to allow for monitoring of deviations from that policy that could potentially lead to or add risk to the organization. Additionally, as we discussed in the third-party vendor component, all external parties and network segments should be considered an extension of the internal network and held to the same protection requirements that you would hold your internal assets to. So, centralized security management should exist and be integrated into the change management process across the infrastructure. By having all of the network and perimeter security devices managed in a centralized way, it allows for the monitoring of events and deviations from policy that we discussed earlier. Additionally, changes to any of the perimeter protection elements should follow the same change management process that has been introduced in earlier components of this discussion. Number 4, a layered approach for network, cloud, and virtualization protection should exist. This is a pretty straightforward requirement, a belt and suspenders approach, but many organizations rely on a single point of protection to stand in the way between external threats and internal assets. By layering this protection, organizations are made more secure by eliminating things like single points of failure and adding in additional methods of threat detection and blocking. So number 5, network segmentation should exist for variations in data sensitivity and classification, access requirements, protection, or regulatory requirements, and business-defined purposes. That's a mouthful of the best practice. Oh, moving forward here. Sorry, we're on the last best practice there. The network segregation should exist for variations. So the data classification best practices we've discussed prior during data protection and governance and compliance extend to this component here as well. A proactive organization will ensure that the network segmentation is not only take into account regulatory or business requirements, but that they're also being built around the data that's stored within the segment and the anticipated safeguards that should be in place to access the data within. So moving on to the next segment here. Security awareness training. This is our final component. So finally, we've come to security awareness and training. This is a component that is oftentimes overlooked by organizations due to cost or resource investment, but can turn your end users into frontline notification points for malicious or suspicious behavior. Additionally, covered in this section are the requirements that Mandiant considers to be best practices in terms of training internal security staff, as well as to combat emerging and sophisticated threats. So when we talk about security awareness training, we certainly have the same 5 best practices here that a proactive organization is going to be looking for. A formal security training and awareness program should be implemented. This is the simple, most foundational, basic requirements of a proactive organization. This program is what will help to define what training is provided and who receives the training. All end users should be required to receive at least a basic level of training in terms of best practices, how and when to notify the security organization of what they consider a suspicious event, what types of threats they may be exposed to, and how to handle those threats. This should be provided to all new users as well, and importantly, before they're given access to the network. Additional training such as secure coding practices, advanced threat detection, proactive hunting techniques should all be considered to be provided to users that have roles that require advanced skill sets. So a lot of your incident response teams or your security operation teams, they may have additional training, or your development teams may have additional training requirements that the organization should take into consideration. Number 2, users should recertify that they have read and understood the acceptable use policy. The acceptable use policy is one of the most critical documents and policies that will actually go out in an organization because it provides accountability back to users and demands adherence to the actual acceptable usage policy. The acceptable use policy by name defines what is or is not acceptable while utilizing company assets, such as the internet at the company or a laptop that is issued to an end user. All users should be aware of the acceptable use policy and should be required to sign it in order to denote adherence to the policy. Once again, this is another one of those things that you want to have signed before giving somebody access to the network. Number 3, there should be an LMS in place in order to monitor training compliance. As new training awareness programs are being developed, an LMS really does help to complement it, and it should be implemented in order to track that all users are actually attending their required training and that they've met the criteria either through attendance to training courses or testing in order to track the compliance to the program. So it's another double checking on the adherence that people are actually going through the required training and are actually not just sitting there listening to it. So adding in some testing elements that ensures that comprehension. Oversight should be provided to the strategic and tactical layers to provide visibility into the effectiveness of the program. Number 4, frequent security awareness communication should be disseminated most often. This will be a newsletter sent via email to the appropriate distribution groups that help to reinforce best practices and make users aware of threats to their environment. So, for example, at one organization that I worked with, the SOC would actually use newsletters in order to let users know about specific threats, like the fake FedEx tracking number emails that were sent out pretty heavily a while back that could actually lead to malware entering in the environment and circumventing the entire organization's perimeter firewall, perimeter securities and internal structures to keep it secure. Because the users were made aware of that threat, the click rates dropped dramatically across the organization. Finally, number 5, security training should be provided and available to all employees regardless of function, location, or corporate affiliation. Simply put, no one should be exempt from the security awareness training, not even the security organization. So that moves us into questions. Let's see here. So a couple questions we have. Of the 10 areas presented, which are the 2 or 3 most important to focus on? That really is going to depend on the industry that the organization is in. Genuinely speaking, different industries are going to have to focus on different things. Data protection is one that's commonly important across all verticals, access management as well, but incident response it becomes really important in several different industries, such as industrial control systems or FISMA, which is federal. PCI is also another big one. So that really does depend on the industry that you're in and will be contextually relevant to those. So the next question is, my organization is very concerned about ransomware attacks. Which security components should we focus on? Typically, that's going to be incident response to respond to any kind of attacks that actually occur. Security awareness training to make your users aware of ransomware attacks and what not to click on and what potential methods or emails they could see coming into their email box that could lead to a ransomware attack. Obviously, if you don't have the ability to propagate across, then doing network segmentation, things like that are also very important to stopping ransomware attacks. But primarily incident response, data protection, access management to make sure people only have access to the networks they need and the file shares that they need so that it can't propagate across the entire network by finding somebody who has access to all of the data file shares. But that appears to be all the questions that we have. So if there are any more, I will give you guys back just a little bit of extra time. I'd like to thank you for attending today. I hope that today's presentation was helpful to provide an understanding of what Mandiant considered to be the 10 primary components of a proactive security organization. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us, and we'll provide feedback and answers to your questions. So thanks again for attending, guys.